We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America.
The Constitution of the United States. It defines our rights as citizens and sets down the rules that describe how our nation's government is to be run. It provides the basic meaning of what it means to be an American. The men who wrote the Constitution 2 centuries ago hoped it would solve the many problems faced by the new nation at that time. But they also wanted it to guide the nation in the centuries ahead. This is the story of how and why they created this amazing document. In the hot summer of 1787, a group of people met in Philadelphia to write a new set of rules for the government of the United States. Among them were some of the nation's most famous men: George Washington, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, and many others. The meetings these men held led to a new set of rules for the United States. This set of rules, the U.S. Constitution, has guided the nation for more than 200 years. The Constitution carefully describes the powers of Congress, the President, and the nation's courts. It creates what's called a federal system in which the national government shares power with the states. It gives a great deal of power to the national government, but it also makes sure that individual citizens keep many important rights and freedoms. Nations all over the world still imitate this document. For the past 2 centuries, millions of people have looked to this country for ideas about freedom, democracy, and a government based on strict but fair rules. Some other nations have even copied parts of the U.S. Constitution for their own use. The United States Constitution is as important to each American today as it was when it first went into effect. Every day, millions of Americans go to their jobs or to school. They take trips, spend money, read magazines and newspapers, visit friends. They attend places of worship, choose their leaders, and work on problems facing their communities. They may not ever think about the Constitution while they do these things, but almost every act is either regulated or protected by this unique document. In a way, it's surprising that the Constitution has lasted as long as it has. According to one expert, since 1970 alone, more than 100 nations have adopted constitutions or changed them completely. But the U.S. Constitution has guided our nation for more than 2 centuries. When our nation's founders gathered there in 1787, Philadelphia was one of the nation's largest cities, but it was small compared with cities today. In 1787, the new nation was a collection of farms and very small towns scattered across an unsettled wilderness. This collection of small communities was having a great deal of trouble just surviving as a single nation. The men who traveled to Philadelphia thought the most important thing they could do was find a way to keep the struggling young nation from falling apart. The founders feared that without a new constitution, the young nation's experiment in democracy would fail.
Our country, my friend, is not yet out of danger. There are great difficulties in our Constitution and situation to reconcile government, finance, commerce, and foreign affairs with our liberties. The prospect before us is joyful, but there are intricacies in it, which will perplex the wisest heads, and wound the most honest hearts, and disturb the coolest and firmest tempers.
John Adams, writing to Samuel Adams, spoke for many of America's leaders in 1786 when he expressed these doubts. Americans had hoped to create a democracy that would be admired by the whole world. Now many of them believed their nation might not even survive. Only a few years earlier, the 13 colonies in North America had won a bitter war for independence from Great Britain. The war began after Great Britain tried to increase its control over the colonies. Many American leaders said the legislatures in these colonies should be free to make their own decisions. When Great Britain tried to weaken the power of these colonial legislatures, the colonists rebelled. In 1776, they signed the Declaration of Independence, breaking all ties with Great Britain. And in 1781, they won their revolution and founded a new nation. By 1787, these original 13 colonies had formed the United States, but they remained fiercely independent from each other. Even the flag they adopted, with its 13 stars and 13 stripes, emphasized that the new nation was made up of these separate states. The leaders of the revolution had fought for liberty and independence. They feared the power of any government to take away the rights and freedoms of the individual. But they especially feared the power a strong central government might have over the states. So the national government these independent states created was very weak. Many leaders of the revolution felt that democracy could only survive if the state governments were stronger than the national government. They thought a strong central government could never rule an area as huge as the entire United States without destroying democracy. One leader put it this way:
So extensive a territory as that of the United States cannot be governed in freedom. Force then becomes necessary to make the government feared and respected.
The new country adopted a set of rules called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles made each state almost as powerful as an independent nation.
Each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and every power, jurisdiction, and right, which is not by this confederation expressly delegated to the United States, in Congress assembled.
The Articles went into effect in 1781. They set up a national Congress in which each state had one vote. But only the state governments, not the National Congress, could raise money by making their citizens pay taxes. Congress had to ask the states for any money it needed, and often the states ignored these requests. Congress had no way to make the states agree to any requests or laws it made. Under the Articles, each state had its own money, and each state made its own rules about trade. Many states set up special taxes called tariffs on goods from other states. This made it hard for each state to trade with others. Bitter arguments among the states became common. In the 1780s, farmers in many parts of the new nation were having a terrible time earning money. Many were sent to prison because they could not pay their debts. Others lost their farms. Some farmers in Massachusetts asked the state government for help, but the government turned them down. Then, about 1,000 farmers, led by Daniel Shays, a Revolutionary War soldier, took up weapons and forced many of the state's courts to close. The national government was too weak to stop the uprising. Eventually, the Massachusetts militia put an end to what is now called Shays' Rebellion. But the uprising had an electrifying effect on the young nation. It led the call to change the Articles of Confederation. People wanted a stronger central government. There was even talk that the Union couldn't be held together much longer if the Articles weren't changed. In a letter to James Madison, George Washington observed the following:
We are either a united people or we are not. If the former, let us in all matters of general concern act as a nation, which have national objects to promote and a national character to support. If we are not, let us no longer act a farce by pretending to it. For whilst we are playing a double game, or playing a game between the two, we shall never be consistent or respectable, but may become the dupes of some powers, and most assuredly the contempt of all.
To solve such problems, 55 American leaders gathered secretly in Philadelphia in 1787 to strengthen the Articles of Confederation. Every state except Rhode Island sent delegates to the Constitutional Convention, which was held in the Pennsylvania State House, where the Declaration of Independence had been signed 11 years earlier. Congress only wanted the delegates to change the Articles. When they arrived in Philadelphia, they decided to keep their meeting secret. The heat and humidity that summer in Philadelphia were nearly unbearable. Despite this, the windows of the State House were kept shut. The delegates wanted to keep people from listening in and spying, and perhaps trying to influence their discussions. Americans had a great deal of respect and admiration for many of the leaders at the Constitutional Convention. Many people believed that men like General Washington and Benjamin Franklin could do no wrong. The delegates knew that most Americans would approve any proposal these two men favored, so the delegates acted boldly when Washington and Franklin agreed to ignore the instructions from Congress and write a completely new set of rules for the government of the United States. Although many of the delegates had fought to break away from Great Britain, they knew that some of their most cherished ideas about rights came from the British. The idea of a written constitution began in England in the year 1215, when King John signed the famous Magna Carta, or Great Charter. In the Magna Carta, King John wrote down a number of rules about his government. The Magna Carta gave some rights to barons, who were England's wealthy nobles. These rights did not apply to other people, but the Magna Carta was important because it put in writing for the first time the idea that government must follow the rule of law and respect the rights of citizens. In the late 1600s, the English philosopher John Locke said that people were wise enough to choose the kind of government they wanted. He said that all government was really a contract, that is, a kind of agreement between citizens and leaders. In that contract, citizens agree to obey the government, but only as long as the government agrees to protect each individual's rights and property. John Locke lived during a time in history known as the Age of Reason, or the Enlightenment. Before this time, most government was imposed on people by powerful elites who didn't believe that ordinary people were smart enough to govern themselves. The ideas of the Enlightenment greatly influenced the Founding Fathers. Locke's idea of a contract between the people and the government is expressed in the preamble to the Constitution. We, the people, do ordain and establish this Constitution. While the delegates in Philadelphia may have agreed with each other about Locke's ideas, they argued for weeks about many problems of establishing a firm, strong, and fair new government for the United States. In writing the Constitution, the nation's founders had to agree to several important compromises. Each delegate had to give up something in order to get a final version of the Constitution they could all agree on.
In passing judgment on this Constitution, you must call to mind that we had clashing interests to reconcile. View the system, then, as resulting from a spirit of accommodation.
One big argument was about how large and small states would choose members of Congress. Some delegates said each state should have a different number of congressmen depending on how many people lived in that state. Under this plan, states with large populations, like New York and Virginia, would have had many more members in Congress than small states like Delaware or Connecticut. Delegates from the smaller states wanted each state to have the same number of lawmakers in Congress. So the delegates decided to create two parts of Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate. In the House, the number of representatives each state has is based on the state's population. But each state has exactly the same number of senators, 2. The decision to apportion seats to Congress this way came to be known as the Great Compromise of the Constitutional Convention. Another controversial issue the founders compromised on was slavery. By 1787, some 650,000 blacks lived in the United States. Most were slaves. Slavery existed in nearly every state, but many northern states were moving towards abolishing it. Most slaveholders lived in the South, and they argued that the planting and harvesting of labor-intensive crops made slave labor necessary. Most enlightened people of the 1780s saw slavery as a terrible thing. In the North, such men as Benjamin Franklin, Benjamin Rush, and John Jay campaigned for its abolition. And in the South, men like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, George Mason, and James Madison hoped that slavery would eventually end, though as slaveholders themselves, they took few measures to help bring this about. Despite these sentiments, there remained a strong force that fervently believed slavery was vital to the South's economy. So the delegates knew they had to deal with the problem delicately. Anti-slavery delegates were afraid Southern states would leave the Union if the Constitution contained any provision outlawing slavery. One big argument had to do with representation in Congress and whether slaves should be counted as part of each state's population. The delegates finally agreed that each slave would be counted as 3/5 of a person in deciding each state's number of representatives and in fixing the amount of taxes the state had to pay. It might seem as though this so-called 3/5 clause meant that the founders viewed a black person as 3/5 of a human being. But the 3/5 clause was actually an attempt to preserve and strengthen the anti-slavery forces in Congress. It was an anti-slavery Northerner, James Wilson of Pennsylvania, who proposed the 3/5 compromise. Frederick Douglass, the 19th century black abolitionist, recognized the damaging effect that the 3/5 clause had on pro-slavery forces. He referred to it as a downright disability laid upon the slave-holding states, in that it deprived them of 2/5 of their natural basis of representation. Given the likely prospect that the Southern states would reject a constitution that made no provision for slavery, the founders compromised, citing the need to preserve the Union as their most important aim. But it was clear to them all that this problem wouldn't go away. The importation of slaves into the United States ended in 1808, but it wasn't until after the carnage of the Civil War that slavery finally came to an end with the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Back in Philadelphia, the convention faced a third challenge, the need for a Bill of Rights. The delegates in the stifling State House spent most of their time devising and adjusting how the machinery of government would work under the new Constitution. Some delegates were worried about the new government's potential effects on the rights of individual Americans. These leaders wanted a Bill of Rights. That is, they wanted the Constitution to list such core individual rights as freedom of speech, press, and religion, the right to a jury trial, the right not to be searched unfairly, and so on. Other delegates said a Bill of Rights wasn't needed. They argued that most states' constitutions already provided for such rights. To this objection, James Madison said,
"It is too uncertain ground to leave this provision upon. Some states have no bills of rights. There are others provided with very defective ones. And there are others whose bills of rights are not only defective, but absolutely improper.
Again, the delegates compromised. They did not at first include a Bill of Rights in the Constitution. Instead, they agreed to work hard and add these rights later as a set of amendments or changes to the Constitution. The first 10 amendments, added in 1791, make up the Bill of Rights. The Constitution was signed on September 17, 1787. But before it could become law, it had to be ratified or approved by at least 9 of the 13 states. Many of the smaller states quickly ratified the Constitution. Delaware was the first, ratifying it on December 7, 1787. The 9th state to ratify was New Hampshire, which gave its formal approval on June 21, 1788. With this, the Constitution technically went into effect. But there was a problem. Several of the larger states, specifically New York and Virginia, had not ratified the Constitution. Many people were concerned that without the approval of these 2 states, the Constitution would be meaningless. Critics of the Constitution cited the lack of a Bill of Rights as their chief objection, but many also thought the Constitution granted too much power to the national government and the president and not enough to the states. Eventually, 2 main groups emerged in this argument. Those who supported the Constitution became known as the Federalists. Those who opposed the Constitution were the Anti-Federalists. In New York, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay wrote a series of essays in which they argued passionately for passage of the Constitution.
To secure the public good and private rights against the danger of faction, and at the same time to preserve the spirit and the form of popular government, is then the great object to which our inquiries are directed.
These essays by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay were printed in newspapers and later published under the title The Federalist. Historians cite the Federalist essays as crucial to mustering the support needed to ratify the Constitution. In Virginia, the great patriot Patrick Henry had rallied the colonists in defiance of Great Britain with his cry, "Give me liberty or give me death." But now he spoke out strongly against the Constitution. He was afraid the president might eventually become as powerful as a king. Eventually, both New York and Virginia did ratify the Constitution. Now, the Constitution had teeth. In January 1789, the states selected presidential electors, and in February, those electors unanimously chose George Washington to be our nation's first president. He was inaugurated on April 30th, 1789. In 1791, as the Federalists had promised, the Bill of Rights was added. These first 10 amendments to the Constitution list and guarantee the fundamental rights and freedoms that each one of us enjoy as American citizens.
Under this Constitution, to be a citizen of the United States will be to be a citizen of the freest, purest, and happiest government upon the face of the earth.
As these words from Dr. Benjamin Rush show, America's leaders wanted the Constitution to be admired and imitated by people all over the world. The delegates were sure that they were creating a new and far better form of government than had ever existed before. However, the nation's founders could never have predicted many of the tremendous changes to come in the years ahead. They could never have known that a nation of about 4 million farmers and merchants would grow into a mighty industrial country of more than 250 million people, many of whom would live in huge cities. The U.S. today faces problems very different from those in 1787. The Revolutionary War was fought with simple rifles and small cannons. Today, a single nuclear bomb can destroy an entire city. In 1787, Americans were only beginning to settle a vast, unexplored wilderness. Today, the land is settled, and now factories produce millions of tons of poisonous waste, much of which is dumped where it can seep into the soil and water. For these reasons, you might think the Constitution must be hopelessly out of date. But this isn't true. Even though it was written to solve problems facing the nation 200 years ago, the Constitution still guides the nation today. The nation's founders may not have known what kinds of changes would occur in the future, but they knew America would change, and they wanted that change to occur in an orderly way, a way that would protect the basic freedoms of each American citizen. So they put in place a system of amendments that would allow the Constitution to grow in order to meet the changing times. Today, this living Constitution continues to help the nation grow. Our founding fathers were not perfect, and neither was the Constitution they wrote. They were men of their times who recognized and protected an institution, slavery, that condemned hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children to lives of endless suffering and hardship. But in giving his approval to the Constitution, Benjamin Franklin recognized both the imperfections and the achievement.
When you assemble a number of men, to have the advantage of their joint wisdom, you inevitably assemble with those men all their prejudices, their passions, their errors of opinion, their local interests, and their selfish views. From such an assembly, can a perfect production be expected? It therefore astonishes me, sir, to find this system approaching so near to perfection as it does. Thus I consent, sir, to this Constitution because I expect no better, and because I am not sure that it is not the best.
Most people regard 1776 as the birth date of our country. Indeed, each year we mark the 4th of July with celebrations, fireworks, picnics, and parades. But in 1987, on the occasion of the 200th anniversary of the Constitutional Convention, President Ronald Reagan suggested that it was with the writing of our Constitution, setting down the architecture of democratic government, that the noble sentiments and brave rhetoric of 1776 took on substance, that the hopes and dreams of the revolutionists could become a living, enduring